Welcome into Four More Pages. I am joined by Dr. Brian Ingrassia, right?
Yes.
Perfect. You are the author of Speed Capital. And so tell me a little bit about how, you're a professor at WT. So tell me how you ended up here on the High Plains, your journey to being out here and ultimately to writing this book.
Yeah, I'm originally from Illinois, and I taught in Atlanta, and I taught outside of Nashville for a few years. But I moved out here to the High Plains about 10 years ago to teach at WT. It's been a good experience. And the way I came up with this topic is I was writing my first book on the history of intercollegiate football, and I was writing about stadiums. And I was in Indianapolis one time, and I saw the Speedway. It wasn't the first time I had seen it, but I saw it and I said, wow, this is big, and why is it here? And I discovered that the Speedway was in a place called Speedway City. And I said, why is there a place called Speedway City? And so I looked. I wanted to read the best thing that had been written about that. I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find anything, at least academic, that had been written about the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And I did a little preliminary research and decided there was a really interesting story there that I thought needed to be told.
And so for you, what was the research process like, kind of bringing this book to life?
Yeah, it was a lot of years of reading digitized newspapers, but also I got to do a couple of research trips. I went to Indianapolis a few times to do research. I also went to Miami to do some research. And the reason why I had to go to Miami is because the person kind of the main guy who built the Speedway, his name's Carl Fisher. He also is one of the primary people who built Miami Beach in Florida. And so he moved permanently to Miami around 1919 or so. So a lot of his papers are in Miami as opposed to in Indianapolis. And so it was again, a lot of years of kind of reading and seeing how what was happening at the Speedway, but also how people were talking about what was happening at the Speedway, whether those were newspapers in Chicago or New York or LA or various other places, because it was really, auto racing was this kind of like national phenomenon, and Indianapolis is kind of the place that we remember. It's the place we know associated with racing, but it was going on in a lot of places, and people were paying attention to it in a lot of places.
And so for you, what was it about the Speedway that made you say, like, that really just caught your attention? Because you had done a book on intercollegiate football, and so what was it about this facility in general that made you say, I need to dive deeper on this?
Yeah, I discovered again this guy named Carl Graham Fisher, who I think, people who are historians, who know Miami Beach or they know Indianapolis, they know about this guy. Like, they've heard of him, but he's nowhere near as famous as somebody like a Henry Ford. And I would say that in a lot of ways, he's probably not quite as important as Henry Ford for like how Americans use and enjoy automobiles, but he's a really important figure. He actually made his fortune as a headlight manufacturer. He was the first person to figure out how to kind of mass produce headlights and sell them to people so people could drive at night. And he took a lot of the money that he made from headlights and he invested it in things like the Speedway, and he invested in Miami Beach, and he also invested it in highways, right? A lot of us probably are familiar with the Lincoln Highway, the first transcontinental highway, and the Dixie Highway, the first kind of north-south transcontinental highway. He's the person who basically came up with the idea for these early highways. And so when I discovered Carl Fisher, I thought he was really interesting because he didn't just build the Speedway, and he didn't just race cars. He also built places that were kind of organized around cars, or you had to have a car to get to Miami Beach, let's say, from the Midwest. And so I thought he was really he's this really important figure for understanding how and why Americans came to use automobiles as much as we have, and kind of how we've built our society around automobiles. And I think the Speedway is kind of like the central point in that, right? He's not just Miami Beach, he's not just the Speedway, but he's all these places that get connected by automobiles and pavement and cars and things like that.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, you had to travel to Miami. I'm from North Florida, so not that part of not that part of Florida, but when you go to Miami, it's like a different culture. The cars are a huge part of that culture. And so to, just hearing you mention that was a big part of his life, it makes a lot of sense when you put things in that context. And so was there anything that you learned in your research that maybe surprised you that you weren't expecting to learn?
Yeah, there's a lot of things about Indianapolis and the Speedway that I learned, but also just kind of when I went to Miami to do research, I had never been to Miami before. I'd never been to South Florida, certainly not that far south in Florida, and just kind of seeing learning about the way that the Speedway as a racetrack was being built kind of at the same time that they were building Miami Beach, which, starts off as a sandbar. And they turned it into this resort city, essentially, and kind of seeing how I think Carl Fisher learned a lot about how to build kind of what geographers like to call machine space, right? Space that's organized around machines. I think he learned how to do that in Indianapolis, and then he took a lot of that knowledge, and then he took it to Florida, and then kind of built this, in some ways, very, very different place from Indianapolis. But it's kind of the flip side, right? It's the flip side of the same coin, where it's all about modern technology and modern usage of time and space. And again, there's so many fascinating things I learned about racing and about the speedway, but also kind of learning about how cities get rebuilt around automobiles in the early 1900s. I think that was a really fascinating thing.
For you, were you big into racing before you started this and big into cars, or was this something that you just kind of stumbled upon and then it kind of just from there you were like, this is cool?
I started writing my first book about football because I was really interested in higher education and like how universities like reach out to the public. And then I kind of got sucked into the field of sport history, which I know sounds like a joke, but it's a real field.
Yeah.
And the more I got interested in sport history, the more I started saying, okay, there are a lot of things that we can understand about modern American culture by looking at sport. And so I've got to admit, I didn't come at this as a big racing fan. But I've learned so much. And I think there are people out there who might say, well, racing's not really a sport, right? It's not about people's bodies, it's about machines. And I would say it's absolutely a sport. It's what we call techno-scientific sport, but it's very much a sport. And I think it does tell us a lot about our society. And so as a result, I wouldn't say this has turned me into an auto racing fan, but I have an incredible respect for the people who do this. It's a dangerous sport. It's about piloting these machines. Piloting is the term they would have used in the early 1900s. Piloting these machines at very, very fast speeds, and sometimes people get hurt and people die. And it's at the same time it's dangerous. It's a really impressive sport. I think that takes a lot of a lot of talent and a lot of skill.
When you were doing research, you went to Miami, did some research there. Were there any other speedways that you've kind of looked at and have kind of caught your attention to maybe you'd want to expand on and do more historical research into those?
Yeah, there are several other speedways that pop up in the book. I especially talk about one in Los Angeles. It was a board track at Playa del Rey. There was also for a brief moment, there was a really famous speedway in Atlanta where I used to teach. And actually, anybody who's ever been through Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, that's actually built on the site. Atlanta's airport is built on the site of the speedway, which was built by these like Coca-Cola guys. They had all this money, they wanted to race, and for like 6 months, it was probably the best racetrack in the world, right? Or one of the best. They claimed they were better than Indianapolis. They might not have been, but that was one that I've written a little bit about in other contexts. I will also say Amarillo had a couple of racetracks, which maybe people who've been around the area for a long time might be familiar with these, but basically they took old playas, dry playas, and they built racetracks around them. And sometimes then, of course, the playa would fill up with water, and maybe that wasn't the best place to do racing. But Amarillo was a place pretty early on that was doing some auto racing. And what you find is that virtually every city around the United States before World War I was doing auto racing. They saw what was going on at Indianapolis and a few other places, and they built comparable tracks. Omaha, Nebraska, I think, had one, and places in Iowa and Illinois, all around the country. Minneapolis, their airport also is built on an old racetrack from before World War I. And so, yeah, we know Indianapolis as the famous one, but there's so many tracks around the country that date from this era.
And so, what is it, from your perspective, from the research that you did, that having this like notable racetrack, what does that symbolize for a lot of these communities?
I think for Indianapolis, it's become kind of a centerpiece of their identity, right? They call it the Crossroads of America. I think about the quarters they put out a number of years ago, the state headquarters. It's got a car on there, right? And I think what happened is that Indianapolis was really good at kind of taking that one place, that speedway, and turning it into this kind of iconic, legendary place in a way that after World War I, a lot of those other places kind of auto racing died out. Now, of course, by the 1930s, we had NASCAR, right, which popped up. It's got a different history, similar kind of thing. And NASCAR has its own kind of meetings, especially for the South. But Indianapolis is kind of unique in that it's the one place that really did hold on to racing and become, the speed capital. And that's where I got the title from. It's Indianapolis is the capital of speed. But I'm also talking in the book about how what's going on with racing is it's about moving capital, right? Value, money from place to place, right? And rebuilding places around that. And so I think of Indianapolis as the capital of speed, but the book's also about how in modern life kind of, economic activity gets speeded up through technology and through rituals like auto racing.
From now, like thinking back to when you first started writing this book to it being published to where you're at today, what's one thing that constantly stays on your mind just about this book itself?
Yeah. There's a phrase that pops up in the first part of the book where I talk about the annihilation of space or space annihilation, which is this idea that in modern life, we have to get from here to there more quickly. And how do we do it? We use technology, right? And we get from here to there a lot in lesser amounts of time. And I really think about that as kind of one of the key concepts of modernity, right? And that auto racing shows us that. It's how people were able to use this technology to get quickly from place to place. And then they created a kind of pop culture ritual out of that. And I think about the fact that, I live here in Amarillo. Every day I drive down to Canyon, at least 5 days a week, I drive down to Canyon, I teach at WT, and I think about the fact that I drive in an automobile that can go, it's pretty easily 75, 80 miles an hour on pavement, and of course right now they're doing all that construction, but we need the machines and the pavement to do that, right? If before I-27, before the Canyon Expressway, I doubt very many people were living in Amarillo and commuting to Canyon, but those are the kinds of technologies that were pioneered at places like the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. The idea that we can get in our cars and drive on, good, smooth pavement from place to place relatively quickly is something that I think we take for granted, but it's something that, again, before, when the Speedway was originally built in 1909, the thought of doing that was just unbelievable. And I would say even maybe by the 1930s and 40s, it was still kind of sort of unbelievable, but we've gotten so good at building those machines and the pavement that it drives on that we don't even really think about it anymore.
And so for you, you mentioned that, you kind of do take it for granted because you're just like, man, like I wish this construction would be done already. But it's like you need the quality of roads to be able to get to where you're going and to be able to get there safely. And so, do you ever kind of go back to this book when you're teaching? Like, how does this impact your teaching?
Yeah, I mean, every other year I teach a sport history class, and so I do talk a little bit about auto racing and things like that. But also it pops up, I teach Texas history, which is funny. I'm a transplant. You wouldn't expect me to be teaching Texas history, but it's one of my favorite classes to teach because I can use examples from Amarillo and from other places around the state to talk about larger changes happening in the United States. And one of the things I do when I'm looking at the 1910, 1911 period is I talk about how Amarillo made a choice in 1910 to put down brick streets, right? I think I drove on one to get here today. Those bricks, the bond issue that paid for the bricks was authorized in 1910, about 6 months after the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was paved with brick. And I think what was happening is I think places like Amarillo were looking at what they were doing in Indianapolis, and they said, well, if they can put down 3.2 million bricks on a racetrack and make it a really good place for cars to go 80 miles an hour, maybe brick is a good thing to be putting down on our city streets for all the people who are starting to buy cars. And so I actually use Amarillo's brick streets, which were actually put down in 1911 downtown and surrounding neighborhoods. I use that as a good example for kind of how people's ideas about transportation technology and infrastructure were changing in the early 19-teens. I mean, I think there's probably other ways that it comes up in my teaching, but that's one just really, one really tangible way of showing students in this area how, something they've probably seen before, those brick streets in Amarillo or Canyon or whatever, are probably based at least in part on the kind of racing that was going on in Indianapolis.
And so I have to ask, when you were writing, how many pages is your book?
Published, it's like 200 pages or so. I spent a lot of, I think when most of us write a book, at least most academics, we build it out and then we trim it back. And then we build it out and trim it back. So there was a lot of that over the years. Thankfully, I cut a lot because you wouldn't want to read all the stuff that I originally wrote.
For you, as someone who is in academia, would you say, it's hard for you to kind of narrow it down? Because obviously this is really fascinating, but it's also kind of think of maybe everyone is not as fascinating, so it needs to be a way where people understand it. So do you sometimes struggle with that in your writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think as academics, we want to balance between making something that's really rich and interesting, but also something that's really accessible. And so I really tried to do that with this book. It's something that I want somebody with a PhD to be able to pick this up and read it and go, oh, that tells me something new. But I also want somebody who just is a fan of racing, or from Indianapolis or one of these places that has had racing to pick it up and read it and say, oh, that's a good story, and I've also learned something from it. But you're right, I think it takes some doing to get it to the point where it's both, interesting but also accessible.
For you, what is the most interesting part of the book, in your opinion?
Oh wow, that's a hard question. I'm going to talk maybe about two things, if that's okay.
Yeah.
There's a chapter kind of in the middle where I talk about how as the races are getting really popular, and I should just say the track is built in 1909. They pave it with bricks a little bit later that year because there were some really deadly races early on. And they realized we need better pavement. Originally, it was kind of tar and gravel. And they realized we need something stronger. They put down the bricks. And then about a year and a half later, they start doing the 500-mile races, 1911. That's what we know as the Indy 500. Although one of the things I discovered is they didn't call it that until the 1950s. It was never the Indy 500 until much later. But the races become very big by about 1913, 1914, kind of right before World War I starts. But that's also the very moment where like Indianapolis is rebuilding itself for automobiles. They're putting in better streets and they're putting in grade separation so you don't get run over by a train or things like that. And so that was one of my favorite parts to write. And as I was writing that part, I realized there was this author named Booth Tarkington who was from Indianapolis, and he wrote, Pulitzer Prize winning novels. And in one of his most famous books, he's got this kind of oblique reference to Carl Fisher and headlights and automobiles. And kind of you can actually see how people in Indianapolis in this time period, they're very conscious of these changes that are happening. Not just, racing's starting, but automobiles are reshaping the city. So that was one part that I found really fascinating. And also, the last chapter talks about how kind of after World War II they built a museum. If anybody's been to Indianapolis before, to the Speedway, there's a museum right in the middle of the track in the infield. They built that building in the 1970s, but the original building was built in the 1950s. And essentially what happens is kind of after World War II, the race becomes it's profitable as kind of a place for demonstrating technology and bringing people in to watch the races, but it's also kind of starting to feed on its own nostalgia a little bit. And I was just really fascinated by the way that nostalgia becomes such an important part of the race even starting in the 1930s, but after World War II in the 40s and 50s is when they really start to kind of commodify and kind of profit from the nostalgia of those races. And they still have, some of the cars from 1909, 1910 there at the museum. And it's fun to go see them, but it's also interesting to see how they have used that story as a way to kind of sell the racetrack.
And so you've mentioned, it was kind of, the racetrack was built and World War I happened and World War II happened. So how did the World Wars impact, not just, how nostalgic people were when visiting, but just the overall trajectory of, the impact that this was having on people in such difficult times?
Yeah. Well, they stopped racing for a year or two during World War I and about 3 years during World War II. And what's really fascinating is that during World War I, they talked about turning it into the Speedway into a training facility for World War I aviators. Okay. That didn't quite happen, but they did bring in these, and this is something I hadn't read anywhere until I was doing my research. They brought in these Italian airplane manufacturers from Italy, and they put them up at the Speedway, and they were building airplanes, some of the first military airplanes for the United States military during World War I. They also used it as kind of like an emergency landing field and a place to like rebuild planes. And there are these long ties between aviation and auto racing, right? It's about using mechanical technology to get quickly from place to place. And in the very early years, aviation's a big part of what's going on at the Speedway. But then that kind of dies out a little bit after World War I. Now, the cars get really fast after World War I, and that's partly because the engines that they're using after World War I are engines that were developed for airplanes. Okay. And so you go from having maybe cars going 80, 90 miles an hour on the track to going like 110, 120 miles an hour, which compared to racing today, that's not that fast. But those bricks within 10 or 20 years, they're not really safe enough for those kinds of speed. And so you do start to have lots of people dying at the speedway in the 1930s because the technology, the auto technology kind of outstrips the bricks. And that's where they start to kind of, again, play on the nostalgia. They start to repave parts of the track with asphalt, so it's not just brick. And then, of course, during World War II, the track just closes down for like 3 years. Weeds start sprouting through the bricks. There's a pretty serious chance that they're going to just turn it into, so they're going to sell the land and they're going to turn it into housing development. Okay. That almost happens, but then somebody who had won the race 3 times before World War II, Wilbur Shaw, he decided that he wanted to try to save it, and they were able to save it. And I would say today, of course, that land is way more valuable as this kind of nostalgic, iconic auto racing place, but in 1945 they weren't sure about that, so it almost did get turned into a housing development. Also, during World War I, not after World War I, during the 1920s, they talked pretty seriously about turning the Indianapolis Motor Speedway into the airport for Indianapolis. Okay. They decided not to, the way some other cities did, but there was that possibility of kind of using that. It's a big piece of land that's good for getting machines up to speed. They talked about using that for an airfield, and that happened in a few other cities, but not in Indianapolis.
And so for you, you mentioned that they had to evolve. As the cars evolved, as the engines evolved, they had to evolve, the pavement had to evolve, and so because people, there's a possibility people were going to die if they didn't evolve, and so what impacted that, just like, if we don't evolve with the times, then we are going to lose people, and this is going to become more of a tragedy than it is something that people can enjoy for entertainment.
Yeah. There are a lot of things that happen. One of the things that happens that's really interesting is the 1930s. They actually kind of reinvent the reason why the Speedway was built in the first place. Because it was built, I would say, basically as a racetrack. But in the 1930s, people start telling this story. They're like, no, it's a testing facility. We are testing out new technology that's going to make, the family car safer, essentially. And it's like halfway true. They are developing new technologies that make passenger cars better, but it's partly they're telling themselves a story because they're realizing every year guys are dying, and how can we justify that? Oh, this isn't just about having fun. This is about making technology better. Now, there are times where they rebuild the track. They repave it. They have all kinds of rules about what the size of engine you can use there and kind of what size the cars are. And so over time, they do try to kind of manipulate the rules, let's say, of racing so that it doesn't, not so many people do get injured and die, but they also kind of reinvent the story of why they're doing it to kind of justify why they're doing it.
And so, it's interesting because I'm not someone who really follows racing. I'll watch it sometimes if I'm at home and it's on TV, but I'm not usually sitting down. But whenever you do see you hear of a race that's happening, do you kind of want to go and check out what the facility looks like just to compare the differences between each facility throughout the country?
Yeah. I'll admit I haven't been to as many of those as I'd like to. Indianapolis is an amazing space to go visit, partly because of the museum. You can tour the track. But it is interesting on the few times when I've seen other tracks, whether they're NASCAR or other IndyCar style tracks, to see these facilities. Now, none are quite as big and impressive as Indianapolis. But it's kind of like, going to different baseball stadiums. I'm a big baseball fan, and I'm always going to different baseball stadiums and seeing how in some ways they're all very similar, but in other ways they're all a little different. And so to see that in different places shows us that there is this moment where lots of people were engaging in this sport, but they were also kind of in different places doing it in slightly different ways.
Did you mentioned that, you're big into sports history. Did doing this research kind of change your outlook on how we classify sports and what is a sport and what isn't, and who is an athlete rather?
Yeah, and it's something I keep thinking about, right? As I teach sport history and I go to conferences and help other people with their writing. I think that we probably don't pay enough attention to what, again, is called techno-scientific sport. But also I think so many times when we look at sport history, we're talking about bodies, right? It's about bodies. And absolutely, sport, as we understand it today, is about human bodies doing amazing things, but it's also about all the other things, right? It's about the stadiums, the places where people come together to watch these sports, or also why we want to not just participate ourselves in sport, but what is it about our society that makes us want to go spend lots of money and spend lots of time in consuming, other people getting our exercise for us essentially. And so that's a question I just keep asking, right? Is why are we as a public, as a people who, talk to each other and think about why we do things, why do we keep doing this and gambling on sport and all these things? And I'm not sure I have a good answer yet, but I keep thinking about that. And I think auto racing is so important because, I think about the fact that how do we get to stadiums today to watch or consume sports? We get in our cars and we drive there. That's 99% of the time probably. And I would say Indianapolis is kind of like the prototype of that. Getting in your car, driving to a place, and there, it's not just they're playing baseball or football or something else, but you're actually watching the same technology that brought you there, and it's actually getting turned into a sport. It's kind of a way of consuming and understanding the technology that's starting to change your life, but doing it in a place where you can pay for a ticket and sit there with a bunch of other people who are watching that same thing happen right there.
That is really interesting. And so before we go, can I ask you to hold up, because you have the book in front of you. How did you
Am I holding it right
Yes, perfect.
There we go.
How did you decide that this was the cover that you wanted to have?
That's a great question. This is published by the University of Illinois Press. They're very good for sport history and Midwestern history, so that's why I decided to go with them. And they sent out a little questionnaire. They said, what kinds of colors should we use? Are there certain colors we should avoid? And I just told them, I said, the whole time I've been working on this for well over a decade at this point, I said, I'm imagining something that has some red and maybe like a black and white checkered flag motif. I think, if you go to Speedway City, they have like banners up in red with black and white checkered flag, of course. And they kept looking for different images, and they'd kind of send me one. And then eventually they came up with this one, and I'll hold it up again. This just happens to be the cover of the 1946 Indianapolis 500 program. Wow. Except what they did is they just replaced all the words with the words of my title and my name. They cleaned it up a little bit too. But when they showed this to me, I said, that's amazing. It's not exactly what I had in mind, but it's pretty similar. It's also cool because the last race that I really talk about in the book is the 1946 race, right? So I start in 1909. I actually start before then. I go up through the post-World War II period, and I talk a little bit about a few later races, but that's the last one I really cover. Okay. And so to have the cover of the 1946 program just turn into this beautiful cover, I was just really, really happy with that.
Yeah. And before we wrap things up, is there anything else that you feel like it is important for our viewers to know about your book?
That's a great question. It's got a lot of pictures in it. I was going back through it earlier today. When you write a book, you don't sit and look at it every day, but every now and then you pick it up and you look at it, and there's just some really cool pictures of Indianapolis and Miami Beach and some of the early races and some of the early aviation contests and balloon contests and things like that. So in addition to kind of telling this story that's about the races, but it's also about the changes in kind of society around them. You can see a lot of that happening through those pictures and the maps that a friend of mine made for me that are in there that I think help us kind of see how Indianapolis kind of invents itself and kind of promotes itself as this central place in a country that's getting kind of tied together by modern technology in the early to mid 20th century.
Nice. And where can people go to purchase this?
I occasionally see copies at Barnes & Noble or Burrowing Owl. I don't know if they have any right now. I'm sure Amazon has copies, or you can probably buy directly from the University of Illinois, but it's out there in paperback, and so hopefully a lot of people want to pick it up and read it and learn from it. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you for being here with me today. This was a great talk, learning about something that I'm not familiar with myself, just kind of getting a different perspective on something that you don't even really think about, all the history that goes into something. So I appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
That is all for this episode of 4 More Pages. We'll see you on the next one.